long way down.
I know. Hi everyone, it's nice to have old friends and new friends here. Since the beginning of this year, I've been in a perpetual pursuit of talented, good speakers for good speeches. We've been through all the places, use them as a joint event, essentially. We've been to Chicago Council, we've been to Buffett Institute on Global Affairs in Northwestern University, and we've been to University of Chicago. It's Institute of Politics, and we will, when we have our own speaker, we'll come back to our home base, which is the River Plaza, this location. That's where we are today. It's always good to come back, and it's always good to have our own talent as a speaker. Today we have Amogh Daduvai, yeah, to tell us about his research on India. Specifically India's economic development from after they obtained their independence to today. India obviously is a very important country in this world, in Asia, in this world today, and more important, the importance is growing by the year. So it's a good time to learn more about India, especially in this world. Its economy is number one significant things, more than military. Well, if you have economy and military, usually will come with it. But usually you have economic war first before you have an actual military war. That seems to be the case in today's world. And Amogh is a strong researcher. He's a data person. He's a data scientist. He's also a student of economics. So he's a great person to educate us on this issue, India's economic development, history, and today. Probably we're gonna have some outlook for the future. So with no further ado, Amogh.
All right, thanks, Eric. I will go ahead and get started. So, as Eric said, I'll give a brief overview of Indian economic developments since 1947, when India became independent. I'll just try to cover some sort of high-level structure, like what does the economy look like, and what are the kind of key developments over the years, and where does that put us today, and what are at least my recommendations for where I think India should go in the future. I'm going to try to not do too much math. I know it's a Saturday afternoon. We all finished a work week. But I'll pull out some numbers here and there, and feel free to stop me if you have any questions. It's very casual, very informal. Let me know if there's anything that comes up, and I will go ahead and get into it. So what are we going to discuss today? What's the agenda? I'll start with a little bit of background and introduction on India and how it came to be. Then I'll give a brief overview of the key developments in India's economic history since independence. Then from there, I'll talk about agriculture, industry, and services, and then I'll end with takeaways and future sort of recommendations. All right, so introduction. India's always been a really fragmented place, and that's kind of a key point that I want to get across, and that makes things very challenging when you're trying to do economic development, right? So just to give a little bit of background on why I'm saying India is so diverse and so fragmented, if you see here on the right, I pulled a map of the most frequent language by different states in India. There's a bunch of these, and there's 22 languages that have legal status. There's 5 major religions on top of that, and just the idea that this piece of land here in South Asia should form a single country. This idea is actually not that old. It's maybe around 100 to 150 years old. The first time this even came up, that India should be a single unified country, was in the late 1800s under high British colonialism. So it's not that old. It's very diverse, and that can create some challenges for economic development because, of course, different groups will kind of want to get their own piece of the pie, or they may not want to cooperate with other groups or things like that. So that makes India very different from something like a China. China is 90% Han, doesn't have the same sort of religious splits. I mean, of course, they have the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, but by and large, not the same level of religious kind of splits in the country. India looks a little bit more like if you were to take Europe and you made that a country, right? Of course, the idea of Indian nationalism, India being a single country, is stronger than in Europe. But just to kind of give you some background, that's kind of our starting point. Then now I'll give a little bit of a discussion of how did India come to be, how did it form, what was the starting point, right? When we're talking about India's economic development since independence, where are people getting started? What's the challenge facing leaders? So I'm sure everyone here knows India used to be a British colony back until 1947. But if you can see here on the left, right, this is a map of India during the British colonial period. And you can take a look, right? There's some of this that's red. And that's the traditional, direct British-ruled areas that are colonies in exactly the way that you would expect. But there's also this green here, and what is this green? This green is actually princely states. So these princely states are kind of weird. So what's happening here is that the British have brought these princely states under what's called suzerainty, where they control the foreign affairs and the defense policies of these princely states. But by and large, these princely states are kind of free to do what they like internally. And so that creates this, again, a very sort of fragmented system, and it kind of makes things hard as we get to independence, which you can see here on the right. There are two kind of key challenges that were facing Indian leaders just at the point of independence, like when they were in the first few months of forming their country. So one is, you have to integrate these princely states because they all have varying levels of integration with British India, or with formerly British India. Some of them had to be conquered by military force. You can see right here in the center, there's Hyderabad. India had to send troops in 1948 to go and take that and incorporate it in because the prince at the time refused to accede to India. Kashmir, the conflict in Kashmir, also was essentially coming from a princely state, and that's caused obviously a lot of problems between India and Pakistan over the years. But that's another example. And then the other major challenge here was the challenge of partition. So when the British left South Asia, they didn't leave it as one country. There was a strong desire at the time to have a separate Muslim homeland, a separate country for Muslims that was carved out of British India. And so that's what you see here as the green color. So that's West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Today they're Pakistan and Bangladesh respectively, but back at that time they were one country. But regardless, that also created a lot of challenges because it led to a mass migration. It's the largest migration of people in human history. 15 million people ended up crossing the border between India and Pakistan at the time. Probably around 300,000 people died. Some estimates will go up to 2 million. So many different unsavory things happened: looting, arson, stealing, trains getting set on fire, and it was a pretty rough situation. So now, given all of that, where are we at the time of independence, right? What's the situation? So the vast majority of people in India are peasant farmers. They don't own their own land. They don't have an incentive to produce much beyond the minimum that they need to survive because they don't get any extra benefit. 1 in 7 people can read. Life expectancy at birth is 32 years. You have millions of people living essentially in tents near Delhi and across North India. The people who've fled from formerly what is today Pakistan into India, and the government had to integrate these princely states because they, of course, had their own government structures, and there's not a lot of industry. So you can understand the scale of the challenge being faced here. It is a legitimately difficult task to try and take this and really turn it into a developed country. All right, so then.
So those numbers were as of 48?
Yeah.
Okay.
14%, 32 years, yeah.
Okay.
47, 48. And then overview of key developments. So I'll just talk a little bit about, what are the key things that I'm going to be talking about throughout the presentation, just before we kind of really get into the meat of it. So as I said, 1947, India becomes independent, and Pakistan and what is today Bangladesh are partitioned away. 1951 is when the first 5-year plan under Nehru, India's first prime minister, is implemented. So that's how long it takes them to really, kind of get things together, sign a constitution, and get started with economic planning after this whole, chaos. The mid to late 1960s is the Green Revolution. This is India's main agricultural policy, and I'll talk about that in a second. 1980s, the government starts adjusting its policy to be a little bit more pro-business. Before that, it was around 30 years of essentially socialism. And then 1991, reforms finally dismantle much of the license Raj, which is essentially the walls of protectionism and government-run business and that sort of thing that are formed around much of the Indian economy. And that's created some significant changes in what the Indian economy has looked like in the last 30 years. And so now if we're looking at GDP per capita in the last 30 years, India has gone from around 2,000 to around 9,000. It's quadrupled in that time. India is much richer, much more productive than it was even 30 years ago today. Its GDP per capita ranking has gone up by a lot. In 1990, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. It's 160 out of 186. Today, it's less poor. The rankings put it at 76 out of 192. Just to be clear, I don't know if I fully trust this 76 number. That seems a little high, but directionally, India has gotten much richer. There's so many more opportunities, and I'll talk about where they're coming from. All right, so first key section I'll talk about of the economy is agriculture. So agriculture generally hasn't been a key focus of Indian government policy, and that's kind of weird. Most Indians work in agriculture, and that was especially true, is even more true, at the time of independence. 70% of people at that time were essentially peasant farmers. So if you're the government, it's kind of weird, right? That there's not really much focus being put on there. And I'll talk about why that is in a second, but just keep that in your mind. Agriculture is really not a focus at all. There's basically nothing done for the first 2 decades until bad economic and weather conditions lead to this risk of famine in the 1960s. So 1965, India fights a war against Pakistan. 1962, India fights a war against China. Both of those end up being pretty expensive. And there's bad weather conditions and drought that lead to this possibility of famine. India's essentially not really super self-sufficient in food at the time, because people can't necessarily feed themselves if there's bad weather. And so then the government's finally like, okay, well, we need to get our act together. Let's help out the farmers. Let's figure out how to make them a little bit more productive. And so what they come up with is called the Green Revolution, where the government finally gets farmers to use fertilizer and to use seeds that yield more wheat and more rice. And so that finally essentially alleviates the risk of famine. Since then, there's been no major risk of famine in India. So that is an accomplishment. But most of the growth from this is tapped out by the 90s, and not a whole lot has been done since then. There are other things that the Indian government tried to do but couldn't, or didn't dedicate enough political capital to make farmers more productive, one of them being land reform, and land reform meaning giving farmers the right to their land so that they benefit from the improvements that they make to it. Generally, we've seen, at least in East Asia, that this is a policy that's worked pretty well. Then there's been some other policies of giving farmers access to, or pooling farmers together so that they can all take a loan to get better farming equipment. That didn't work super well either. So these policies have been tried, but essentially not enough political capital was dedicated such that they ever really worked. So now where are we? today in terms of Indian agriculture. So since the 90s, there's not really been much progress. Farmers are less poor today than they were in the 1960s or 70s, but they're still significantly disadvantaged by global standards. I actually just read an article in The Economist saying that there's no more extreme poverty in India, essentially, so that's a legitimate accomplishment. But there's these farmers are still relatively globally poor. Life is still not great. And the percentage of workers in agriculture hasn't really decreased by that much over time. I mean, it's decreased a little bit. It was 63% in 1990. It's 44% in 2023. So it has gone down, but not by anywhere near as much as, say, East Asia. And that's because people who are farmers don't have as much of an opportunity to do more productive work in unskilled labor elsewhere. So in the absence of that, if those opportunities aren't there to make workers more productive by moving them into the cities and having them do unskilled labor, agricultural productivity has to increase to make these farmers richer. And so this can be done with things like land reform, with improving technology through better irrigation, expanding access to credit. There are things that the Indian government can do, and I think off and on they've tried, but a lot of Indian farmers would significantly benefit from political capital really being dedicated towards making these reforms that would improve their productivity. All right.
And what are the
Yeah.
major crops of their agriculture?
Rice and wheat.
Rice and wheat?
Wheat's big in the north, rice is big in the south.
And what about cotton?
I was talking about food crops. I think cotton is grown, especially in the Bengal area. Cotton, jute, that sort of thing. But I'm a little bit less familiar with cash crops.
Okay.
So it was my fault. I forgot to. I was too excited about this for him to start. I forgot to give us an idea of what the agenda will be like. He will present, then you hold your questions until Q&A. We have 30 minutes after the end of your last word. 30 minutes Q&A. Let's keep the questions relevant. Indian economy, that sort of thing. Just like those are your questions. And then at the end of the 30 minutes, you can still continue to ask questions, but will not be limited to question answer. You can debate, you can discuss, you can voice your own comments and stuff. That would be more free form, or you can even talking about a little bit unrelated. You can divert from the main topic, but let's keep it to the topic in 30 minutes in Q&A. Mm-hmm. Then after that will be free form. All right, thank you. Sorry.
All right. So now I'll talk about industry. So I said, a minute ago when we were talking about agriculture wasn't a key focus of Indian economic policy from the government. So what was? It was industry, and especially heavy industry. So things like steel, things like cars, things like fertilizer. This is a key focus that Indian leaders want to focus on. So one of the roles that India played during the British colonial period was a market for finished goods that Britain made in Britain itself. And so a lot of post-colonial leaders, especially in the British sphere, had this idea that, okay, we used to be this sort of market in the colonial period for British goods. Now we just need to make our own stuff. We need to take their stuff, throw it out, and now we need to figure out how to make our own stuff. And so it's a sort of economic nationalism through doing your own manufacturing, which is a policy called import substitution. I'm happy to talk about that after the discussion. I think it's a really stupid policy, and it's been tried, in India, it's been tried in Ghana, Tanzania, Argentina. It's never really worked anywhere, but I'm going to digress from that. Regardless, Nehru, India's first prime minister, leaned socialist, And he's looking to the Soviet Union as a model. So in the 1930s, the Soviet Union had gone from being essentially a country of farmers to an industrialized country. Stalin said essentially they have to do what the West did in 100 years in 10, or something like that. Now I'm paraphrasing a little. And essentially it worked. And socialists across the world looked at that model and said, yes, that looks like something that we need to copy in our own country. And so that's what Nehru is kind of pushing as he's prime minister. And you can see here on the right, I've quoted Nehru. He said, to import from abroad is to be the slaves of foreign countries. So it's really, thinking about this economic nationalism, right? We need to develop our own heavy industry. Now, where does that get us? That leads to this setup called the license permit quota Raj, or the license Raj for short. So the government deploys this very, very restrictive system in order to try and develop heavy industry. So what does that mean? It means that imports have very high tariffs, and that's both on intermediate goods. So, for example, if I'm making a car, right, intermediate good might be steel. There's not only high tariffs on cars that are being sold into India from abroad, but there's also high tariffs on the steel. There's also a system of licensing requirements that says, if I'm a private company, I need to get a license from the government if I want to expand my production beyond X number of workers, or if I want to move to a different location, or if I want to build a new product. All of these things I need to get a license from the government. And the government itself was actually running state-owned companies in a couple of sectors as well. And they also made it very difficult for foreign businesses to operate in India. And so where does this land up, right? What is the end result of this? The government really cannot bring about the growth in heavy industry that it so desperately wants during this license Raj period. So think about it, right? Before this conversation, we were talking about the Trump tariffs, right? So now let's think about if you're trying to make a car in India, because that's what the government says. The government says we need to figure out how do we make cars in India. So, of course, the foreign cars are taxed or tariffed at a very high rate, so they can't directly be imported, or they can, but at a very high cost. Now imagine that, in the case of Trump, he's put up tariffs on steel and on aluminum, and that's essentially the same situation here. Now, if I'm an Indian car manufacturer, I benefit from these foreign manufacturers getting tariffed, but I'm also struggling because I can't really acquire steel or aluminum very cheaply at all, because there's a tariff on foreign production, and it's not that easy and not that fast to spin up a domestic industry of steel. Of course, eventually you do get a domestic steel industry in India, but it takes time, it's expensive, and there's not a lot of it.
But didn't they make deals early on? For example, with Chrysler, they made a deal.
Shall we leave the question at the end?
It's not a question, it's a comment.
Comment, and then that will be after the Q&A. No, even further down.
I'll forget.
Oh, I know, you need to leave early to make the other.
Well, but not yet. No, I just know that the Indian government made a deal with Chrysler that if they would build the cars, or at least assemble them in India, they could have kind of a free reign, low tariffs or whatever. And you saw only Chrysler Corporation cars during the late 50s. Obviously you weren't even born then.
Yeah. I thought at the
You
time...
never
I
know.
was.
You never know. you may be 80, you look young. But let's keep it up to the agenda,
Okay.
because Ernie has to leave kind of early.
Yeah.
So, but other than that, let's
About that.
keep the question after the speech.
Yeah, to that point, Suzuki actually made a joint venture with the Indian government that had set up a company called Maruti to make cars, and nowadays. And because of that, they had this joint venture and they were able to get around the tariffs, but this came much later. This was like the late 80s to early 90s, I
Okay.
believe. But yeah, okay. So the government is not able to bring about this growth in heavy industry because there's this high cost of inputs. There's no comparative advantage. There's no reason to make things like cars or things like steel or things like fertilizer in India. There's no competitive advantage that producing in India has. The supply chains aren't set up. The knowledge isn't there. And it's just generally like there's no necessarily like value add in making in India. Then there's also no competition. So as I said, as a private company, there's all kinds of licensing requirements that you need to get. You need to get permission to do basically anything. And so essentially what that lands up as is only a few companies that are able to navigate the system of licenses are really able to compete, are really able to play in the market. And so that means that for a lot of these products, there's not really much competition. There's no driving force to lead products to be built at a better price and at better quality. That's just not there. And lastly, and similar to this idea that there's no competition, there's no focus on exports. So in East Asia, one of the things that you see is that the governments encourage successful exporters. They pay export subsidies to companies that are able to sell their goods abroad successfully. Why does that matter? Because when you sell your goods abroad, you have to compete with the best of the best. You have to compete with the best products at the best price with the best quality. But if you sell into India, there's not that many companies that are selling, and you don't really have to try that hard. You don't have to work that hard to develop good products. And so again, there's another force that's leading this sort of heavy industry to produce essentially low quality products. And ultimately, at the end of the day, where this lands up is Indians have no choice but to buy this high priced, low quality products because there's no competition anywhere. And they also, because India is so poor, don't have the money to buy these products at scale. And that means that these companies that are manufacturing in India domestically even, they're not even triggering economies of scale because they don't have enough purchases even domestically to do that. And so it makes these goods that's another reason why these goods are so expensive, because there's no scale. And so I've been talking about heavy industry. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about light industry. So while the state and focused on heavy industry, it really put a lot of its resources there. Consumer goods were basically left to were left to this thing that's called unorganized manufacturing or cottage industry. So that's consumer goods. So things like furniture, things like clothes, personal care. This is left to essentially cottage industry. Now, what is cottage industry? It sounds like a kind of weird term, right? It's essentially artisans sitting in a room, working together to build stuff, the way that maybe their grandfathers or great grandfathers built it. What the cottage industry is legally is it's a company that has less than 10 workers or less than 20, but doesn't use electricity in the manufacturing process. Basically you just get a group of people together and get the screwdrivers and the hammers, and then you build whatever it is that you're going to build. That's who is building things like furniture, things like clothes. Those are the people that are doing it. And in fact, in the 1970s, India doubles down on this, and it becomes illegal to make these sorts of consumer goods anywhere in a large factory. So essentially, these groups of artisans have the full legal authority and legal right to make these. No one else can. And the idea behind this was to encourage people to just be employed. The thinking was if you push this sort of manufacturing, this sort of easier quote unquote manufacturing to essentially these artisans, then you'll be able to employ a lot of people. Now, just because you employ a lot of people, though, doesn't mean that it's a good thing to employ them that way. For example, if I hired, 1 million people here in the U.S. to go, let's say, like, clean the streets. Yeah, I might get a little bit of benefit from getting like 1,000 people on the streets to clean them, but if I get 1 million, it's probably too many. So the point I'm making here is just because these jobs are created doesn't mean it's a good thing. And so in addition to that, there's a lot of labor regulations on large factories that push workers into this sort of unorganized manufacturing. A lot of the times, large factories have to take permission from the government in order to be able to let people go or things like that, even if the business is struggling. And so at the end of the day, there's a lot of unorganized manufacturing in India. And this is all sort of a legacy of the pre-1991 period. So now the 1991 reforms, these are huge. They're absolutely crucial to understanding India today. Basically what happens is this set of policies that encourage this sort of socialist path of development are essentially done away with in many cases. The tariffs are slashed, restrictions on private businesses entering certain industries are lifted, a lot of state-owned companies are sold to private investors. Foreign companies are finally allowed to do business with some level of ease in India. And this really sort of sets India on a sort of higher growth trajectory, as we talked about before. And how does that affect industry? Well, it helps. It makes it easier to get input goods. You can get things like steel or aluminum cheaper if you want to make a car. And so production has become more efficient. But these restrictive labor laws, that say, you can't say let people go within a year, they still push people into unorganized manufacturing over organized manufacturing. These old labor laws on organized manufacturing are still on the books, and infrastructure is still not great in the space of Indian industry. And so to really unlock its manufacturing, India needs, of course, more infrastructure, but they need less restrictive labor laws so that they can convert informal manufacturing, this sort of cottage industry, into formal manufacturing. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So,
what is the time period now we're talking about the 90s?
Yeah, I'm talking about post 1991.
Post 91. Okay.
Post 91. So post 91, I've pulled a comparison here of organized versus unorganized manufacturing from the early 2000s. I think that these numbers are from 2005, but basically, they'll still provide you a sort of general picture, right? Comparing organized versus unorganized manufacturing. So organized manufacturing produces 5 times as many goods with 1/6 as many workers. The wages are 10 times as high in organized manufacturing as they are in unorganized manufacturing. Overall, it seems to be a much better system of production because it's much more efficient and will generate much more wealth. But I've got these statistics here on the left, but you can see here on the right, cottage industry on the top versus organized manufacturing here on the bottom. Which one do you think is more efficient? You can all take a look at this. I think it's very clearly going to be the second one. Getting people together in factories where factory managers have figured out, okay, we need to get this amount of inputs to this worker at this time, and we're going to have this person work for this long. It's so much more efficient, and the numbers here bear this out. So really, this idea of converting unorganized manufacturing to organized manufacturing would likely improve Indian manufacturing productivity by quite a bit. All right, lastly, I'll talk about services. So what do services look like before the 1991 reforms? Again, much like manufacturing, services are also highly regulated. There are restrictions on imports, there are restrictions on private business operating. The government owns monopolies on a lot of industries. So, for example, if you've ever flown on Air India, the government of India used to own Air India. That's why it still sucks so much. They've sold it to a private company in the last few years, and it has gotten better a little bit since then, but it's really kind of hampered by this legacy of being under the Indian government and having no competition. Similar to, heavy industry, right? There's no competition, there's no need to compete, so there's no need to offer a better product at a better price. Things like just getting a phone installed, getting a landline phone took several years in the early 90s. Getting a cell phone took several years. It made things very, very difficult to be productive, even in the service industry. So to do things like banking, and the governments and even taking over banking, to do things, say, like construction or to trade abroad or things like that. This is all very difficult. But after the 91 reforms, services have really been unleashed, and they are now the main growth driver of the Indian economy. And I'm just going to point out, this is actually pretty weird. So if you compare this sort of services dominance in India to any of the East Asian countries that have industrialized, they industrialized through manufacturing, and still manufacturing forms a huge percentage of these countries' economies. But in India, it's really the service sector that's the most dynamic, that's really growing, that's really pushing Indian economic growth up. And that is something that's kind of a unique feature in India. How does this happen? India has a bunch of world-class colleges and universities that are built to train a few people to do advanced manufacturing work. So, let's say if I'm building like a car, right? We're going back to that example. I need a couple of electrical engineers, mechanical engineers who really know what they're doing. Beyond that, I don't need that many engineers, but I do need a few who really have their stuff together. Now I can set up these IITs to do that. And post 91, since the reforms, a lot of these IITs now teach software engineering instead of electrical engineering. But really, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not that hard to take a university that does a really good job at teaching electrical engineering and get them to teach software engineering instead. There's a high degree of English proficiency among the Indian elite, makes it easier to connect with people across the world, especially to act as like a back office for functions in the US or Canada or the UK. Getting inputs is cheaper. It's much easier to get mobile phones now. So many people in India now have cell phones where, or landlines compared to, the 7-year waiting list in the early 90s. Now there's foreign investment that's allowed. A lot of foreign companies have come to India, and they've set up capability centers. Microsoft, I think, has around 20,000 employees. Google, I think, has around the same. And this is really, all of these things taken together have really allowed the services sector to take off. And this is especially the case in high-skilled service jobs. So this sort of people in IT or in business services, that works. And that's really the huge growth engine for the Indian economy. One of the other things that's happened, though, is that there actually has been improvement in construction and hospitality. So there is a little bit of a place for people without, these degrees, like from college, say, former farmer. There is some space for former farmers to go work in construction or to go work in hospitality. But really, the growth engine is things like IT and business services. So now, what are the takeaways? What are the points that I want everyone to kind of go home with? So with agriculture, agriculture is productive enough to avoid famine, but not really a whole lot beyond that. If it's going to act as a real wealth generator in India, India needs to do things like land reform. It needs to give those peasant farmers titles to their own land so that they actually benefit from improving their own land productivity. They need to improve things like irrigation. They need to invest in the technology to make that happen. They need to make it easier for their farmers to get loans so that they can get better equipment, so that they can get more out of their land, right? In regards to industry, industry is still hampered by all of these problems, all of these regulations that have made it unproductive to manufacture at any scale. And if the Indian government is able to essentially push people from this sort of cottage industry, unorganized manufacturing, into commercial industry, you know, large factories, with the focus, especially with the focus on exports, on competing abroad, on delivering high quality products at a good price, and they can really generate scale. They can trigger that economies of scale. They can drive down price, and they can really become competitive internationally. And they can really use a lot of unskilled labor towards this, and overall, over time, they can move up the value chain and, you know, become more productive in much the same way as the East Asian countries did. But this is only if the Indian government is able to push people out of this unorganized manufacturing, this sitting together in a room and, you know, hand assembling, and into a real factory. Services are the biggest wealth generator in India right now, but they employ a pretty small percent of the population, especially IT and business services. I'm sure, you know, many of you have worked with these people. You've heard about, you know, the TCS, the Wipro, the Cognizant, HCL. But at the end of the day, right, India's a country of 1.4 billion people. These industries employ something on the order of hundreds of thousands to low millions. So the scale isn't there to employ everyone in India in one of these jobs. So to get the maximum value out of this sector, either we need to, or either the Indian government needs to increase the ability of its people to be able to participate in the sector. It needs to do a better job at educating them so they can go to university, so that they can get the degrees that they need to get in order to be able to participate in these industries effectively. Or they need to take the returns from this sector and funnel it towards building better infrastructure, improving education, improving healthcare, to make people in the other sectors in agriculture and industry more productive. All right, I think that's it.
So here we begin the Q&A session for 30 minutes. Ernie,
Yeah, no, my first question is, you said life expectancy was 32. That was back when?
Like 47.
And what is it now?
I don't have that number
You
offhand.
gave us the improvement in per capita GDP.
Yeah, let me check that for you. 67.74.
Oh, that's,
Yeah.
yeah, substantial.
Substantial improvement.
Okay.
But that was brought down because of infant mortality rates, right?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Whereas that's for the, because most people don't live to be 37, it's just the infant mortality rate skews the numbers.
Yep.
What role does the caste system play, if any, in economic development?
This
So
is
that-
one. Yeah, go ahead.
I imagine people just, even if they want to do something else, they're not, it's heavily frowned upon or impossible in some cases to do something in a different segment.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I wish I had Ethan here to provide more color on this. He would really be able to answer this question better than I can. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think the caste system does make it harder for people to go and do things that they're interested in, or pursue opportunities that they think has high ROI, because within Indian caste, you're encouraged to have a job within this certain set of parameters that the caste says that you are, and a lot of the way that the caste system works is that all of your sort of social connections are only within this caste, and so it makes it very hard to cross castes. Say, if I'm like urban worker, or even if I'm a farmer, the chance that I can go and get a loan from somebody who's better off is not that high, because I don't have connections with them to go and do that. I'm likely to only really associate day to day with people kind of within my own caste by and large, especially if you're a rural farmer. This is, I think, a little bit less the case in the city, but I think in some ways the principle would still hold.
Has that slowed down, kind of like, because in much of the world we know about how many people have left the rural areas to go to the cities, and I mean, if I'm not mistaken, is it still kind of like a higher percentage of people are still farmers, maybe because of they're not able to just like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly part of it, but I think also the economic opportunities to use this sort of unskilled labor in India isn't as good as it could be, right? In East Asia, right, because there was such a big push to get low-skilled manufacturing, a lot of those farmers, especially who didn't need to really be farming anymore because of the improvements in productivity after land reform, there was a lot of demand for them to work in low-skilled manufacturing. But India hasn't quite had the same thing because so much of its manufacturing is tied up in this sort of cottage industry. And so there's not as much of a push there's not as much of a pull to get Indian farmers into the cities, and there's not as much of a push in the sense of getting them out of the farms because the farms aren't that productive.
Still a lot of cottage industry now,
Yes.
like today, 2025?
I mean, I can look into it a little bit more, but yeah, as far as I understand, that's still like a very significant thing. In fact, a lot of the times, like fully like commercial factories, because they have so many regulations around what they can and can't do, will contract with unorganized manufacturing companies to do part of their production or something like that, because they have fewer restrictions on what they can and can't do.
They're not regulated.
Yeah.
Any questions? Okay, I have other questions. Who was the PM in the 1991? Sounds like 1991 is kind of like a watershed as far as Indian economy. Who was the PM? I wonder if I heard this name.
That was, I think, Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
Oh, okay.
I think I kind of mentioned this offhandedly during the presentation. Indian policy moved a little bit toward, like, a little bit away from the sort of socialist orientation around like the 1980s. But it was really 1991 that kind of was the big turning point.
Liberalized.
Yes.
Around the same time that England had their Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher
Yeah.
to go into the neoliberalism, and Ronald Reagan shortly after that.
Yeah.
Around the
And
same
also
time
the fall
India
of
had that.
also the fall of the Soviet Union Communist Party.
91,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I got it wrong. The
Yeah.
British and American, they're 1 year out, 10 years prior. So I messed
Yeah.
up. I messed
Yeah.
up. So that's coincided with the fall of Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, so the initial turn in the 1980s is actually a political decision. So what happened was Indira Gandhi, she's the daughter of Nehru, India's first prime minister, becomes prime minister, I think in the 60s. And in the 70s, in 1977, there's some case brought against her that essentially is going to disqualify her from running or from being prime minister. Before 77, she's all in on socialism. She's put out this campaign called Garibi Hatao, which translates to remove poverty. So she's all in on, you know, socialism, on helping the poor, you know, whatever that sort of thing is. But after this court case, threatens to remove her from power, what she does is she basically seizes power herself. And so there's this 2-year period in India called the emergency, where Indira Gandhi is essentially ruling as a dictator. But in 1979, Indira Gandhi decides, okay, well, there's an election coming up. I know I've jailed all of my political opponents and everything, but I'll let them out. I think I can win this election fair and square. And now, if I do that, you know, my mandate to rule is going to go through the roof. And then she got wiped out. So she was wrong. But the government that replaced her fucked things up so badly that there was another election in 1980 and she came back to power. And this time she was like, I'm not going to make the same mistakes as I did before. I'm going to move towards, you know, at least like a little bit of a more pro-business policy. So that's what happens in 1980. Then under her sons, who are educated at Oxford, at Cambridge, she comes to be influenced by this sort of Reagan, Thatcher, sort of neoliberal reforms. She gets assassinated in '84 after there's some conflict with the Sikhs. But by 91, India is facing a balance of payments crisis, meaning they don't have enough foreign currency, to import the things that they need to import at that time. And so Vajpayee, the prime minister, says, all right, like, we need to go get bailed out from the IMF. So he gets the IMF bailout, and as part of the conditions for the IMF bailout are, you need to get rid of some of this. But Vajpayee goes further than what the IMF says. He says we need to dismantle the whole thing. And then after that, 92, 93, India's economy takes a hit, but from 94, it's growing again.
So Alex, just as the caste system in the economic development, what the role it plays. So I would like to ask, what democracy or Indian democracy, what role do they play in the economic development in India?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there have been pros and there have been cons to the way that India's government is set up. But I'm not fully convinced that if India was not democratic, it would really be particularly better off. So what do I mean by that? With something like democracy, with rule of law and that sort of thing, and the way that the Indian government was set up, right, at the time of independence, it was essentially an elite endeavor. The only people who would ever be able to conceive of holding power are elites, and the support base is also elites. One of the things that we see in Indian democracy is that oftentimes, while people do have the right to vote, they do exercise that right. They often will just listen to, especially like rural farmers, they'll listen to their village headman who says, I'm going to tell you to vote this way, you should vote this way. Or if they're urban workers, they might, and they're part of, say, like a labor union, they'll listen to, what their union leader says. They say, the union leader says, I need you to vote like this, and they'll do that. And so that's kind of made things hard in the sense of really being able to do economic development, because the average person is not really the support base for the government. The support base for the government comes from the set of rural elites, and so that, I think, that has caused some challenges, and I think that's just because the Indian government came straight from the British. There was no, in China, right? There was a civil war, and the CCP had relied on the role of the peasants. They wanted to get rid of the landlords because landlords were aligned with the Nationalist Party, but that wasn't the case in India, right? So that's created this situation where the elites are kind of this key constituency in Indian democracy. But to the point of, do I think India would be better off without democracy? I don't necessarily think so. I think India probably would have really just been poorer and like because without democracy, I think there's no way to sort of check the rulers who make stupid decisions. Of course, you know, many rulers in India through its first several decades made all kinds of stupid decisions, and we talked about a lot of them today. But at least I think with democracy, there's some way to ensure that there's some level of feedback and there's some level of like, you know, people aren't living in a sort of super biased information environment.
What's the literacy rate today? You said it was 1 in 7.
I think it's like 70-something%.
Okay, so that's gone way up too. And how do people get their news in India? Do most people read a paper, or is it TV and radio like here?
It's a mix. In cities, it's usually papers.
Yeah.
I would say in the rural it can vary, but I think most people usually use like their phones or something.
And younger people, social media like here?
Very heavily. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think cell phone penetration is actually pretty high. I mean, of course, not everyone has like a smartphone the way that we have here, but very frequently people, I think almost everyone has a cell phone. And this is something that you see in Africa too, that it's very easy to get cell phones in people's hands, and so you know, you can kind of skip the step of landlines and that sort of thing, computers.
Do the cell phones in India, especially the rural areas, do they tend to be from like the hand-me-downs from the 2000s or early 2010s?
Oh, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I do know that it's not that expensive to get cell phones into people's hands, but
Smartphones, you're saying?
yes, smartphones is expensive, but like the old sort of flip phones that we all had, those
so
are
that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
You're talking about flip phones.
yeah, I'm talking about like the phones that we all carried around in the 2000s.
And when you say the elites, is that within the context of the caste system? Is there like a?
Often.
I believe there's like a political sort of caste or something.
Yeah. Like, I mean, so there's 5 major castes in India. So at the top are the Brahmins, who are responsible for like religious ceremonies. Then below them are the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste. Below them are the merchant caste, which I'm not going to be able to get the Sanskrit name. Below them are the Shudras, the farmer caste, and below them are the Dalits, or the untouchables. So often the people in India who form the elite either come from the Brahmin caste, because the Brahmin caste are sort of religious leaders. They're most likely to have learned to read from a young age because they have to read, you know, religious texts. So often, you know, you'll see elites coming from that caste, but you'll also see it frequently coming from the merchant caste as well. You know, the merchant caste are, of course, the people who are most likely to engage in commerce, and so, you know, they have sort of financial resources beyond what the sort of average everyday person does, and so, you know, maybe they're more likely to land up as leaders of in large commercial manufacturers, or doing some service job, something like that, trade, that sort of thing.
Is it fair to say? I'll go ahead, Dale.
We could finish.
Is it fair to say that it's very throughout the 75, 80 years, it's been very centralized at the federal level? Just the government in general, like do local governors or anything hold
They
any
do.
influence?
Yes, India is actually a federal state. States do have power in the same way that, you know, states in the U.S. have power, and there have been cases where the state government pursues one policy and the federal government pursues a different policy. For example, there was a period in the Sri Lankan Civil War, I think the late 80s or early 90s, where the state government of Tamil Nadu was funding one side, but the federal government was funding the other side. And they didn't really know that the other one was funding the other one, but like they both were doing it. So
It's kind of wild.
yeah.
How did that happen? Because ethnic connection or economic?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
The majority of Sri
Yeah.
Lanka
In
Sunnis,
Sri
and
Lanka,
then the
in Sri
Tamils.
Lanka, a lot of people are
Yeah.
like of Tamil descent. but they're not exactly the same. So it's like mainland Tamils versus like Sri Lankan Tamils, and some people say that there's pretty distinct differences. I would say nowadays, even culturally, there's pretty significant differences, but that's part of the reason people in Tamil Nadu are willing to provide a lot of funding towards.
Also, in terms of the federal versus state power, if you go back to establishing India as a fledgling democracy, this was actually one of the really smart things they did, because India is so diverse religiously and most importantly by language. And so if you're smashing together all of these cultures into one mega country, how do you even begin to have a central government in that situation? The solution was put a lot of power to the states. So the states have their own official languages and stuff, and their own rules about schooling. There's rules about which languages the schools teach. So like there was a program, it was I think it was like a 3+1, or was it 2+1, something like that? 2+1, right? That seems right. It was like Hindi, your local language, and then one additional language, which was often like a village language or something very regional. And that way they were able to get people from such varied backgrounds to function as one single country, kind of, as much as you can.
Yeah. And one of the things that was done kind of early on in Indian history, I think in the 1960s, was states were created on linguistic boundaries, and they still essentially act like that today. A lot of states, especially like South India and East India, speak their own language that other states don't. Of course, there are some exceptions, but by and large, states are formed down linguistic lines.
Like, yeah, my friends, bunch of Indian people, like in undergrad, they spoke English with each other because they spoke different languages that were local to whatever region of India they were from. They couldn't communicate in non-English languages. They didn't speak the same languages.
Has it always been lingua franca, English? Throughout? Or?
Courtesy of the British.
It's in lingua franca.
But like even in rural areas?
No. It's English is spoken fluently by like 15% of Indians. So it's really a language of the elite. It's not, I would say, like something that the average person is really going to communicate in. Depending on like where someone is, they might either use their sort of regional language, or they might use Hindi to communicate, or I guess depending on who they're communicating with, or and where they are, they'll probably use one of the two.
So I have two questions for just. I'll start with you a bit later, but for the one lady, I don't know your name.
I'm Maya.
Hello, my name is Dale. So this is just a quick question. In your opinion, I'm assuming you're from your ancestry, like from the north of India.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view Southern Indians, like the Vedians and?
So I guess it really depends on how you're raised by your parents. So my dad immigrated as a kid, and then I was raised half Indian, and so I'm a product of my own raising, which is a dad who is very tolerant and open to all sorts of cultures and traditions, and so he raised me to understand the difference between North Indian and South Indian cultures at a very broad level, and to recognize that what people assume is Indian culture is often North Indian culture. And so, but that's not true of everyone who's raised by North Indian parents.
How about the bad parents? What kind of children?
Well,
What kind of mentality the children have?
well, yeah, the very conservative parents who have very strict political ideas about India and also about Pakistan will raise their kids with much more restrictive ideas about approaching religion and culture. So like the tensions between Hindus and Muslims, it's a generational thing in my personal opinion, where it's passed down from parent to child and then it's maintained and those tensions stay. And so like having a parent who doesn't break that cycle makes it much harder for the child to break the cycle later and increase overall tolerance, and that results in then stronger anti-Muslim sentiments, for example, in India. And so I don't know, I just have a lot of thoughts about the diaspora and how they raise their kids, but I would say I got lucky.
Dale, I can actually provide a little bit of a point of view on your question between North India and South India. My mom is North Indian, my dad is South Indian, and that's caused some it's caused some interesting dynamics. We'll say over the years. When my parents wanted to get married, for example, my dad's family was not particularly happy, in large part because my mom was from North India. And they kind of refused to give him permission to do that until his grandma intervened and was like, oh, you know, I had a friend from the same area as Ram, my dad's wife, or Pooja, like my mom is from. So and I think they're good people. You can go ahead and get married.
I see, it's also brings me to another question. In the internet, you get the country that you're presenting gets a lot of flack online, and it's mostly like very negative, like from memes, stating from like poor peasants cleaning themselves with unsanitary things. Let's just say, I'm sorry if I cannot say the polite version of it. Like you probably know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like, so how do you feel about your country and some forms of the online sphere is like viewed very negatively, almost like a comical joke,
So I mean, I don't know. That's kind of a hard question for me to answer. I feel like I mostly just tune it out because I don't take the people who are saying those things seriously, but like I don't think I'm necessarily the best person to answer that. I don't know, I think the people who are just like, oh yeah, like India sucks, they're not serious people. Like you can certainly make claims about how things in India are less than ideal and could be better, but just saying, oh yeah, like India bad, it's not a serious.
I mean, I even talked to someone online. I think he's originally from Turkey. He has never been to India, but he assumes that he doesn't want to go there based on the images and pictures that he's seen online. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a tourist, it can be a very challenging experience. I mean, the times that I've visited India, it's been very challenging for me, especially because usually when I go to India, I visit my dad's parents, my grandparents.
In what state do they live in?
They live in Telangana. So they live in Hyderabad, so the state is Telangana.
You were born here, no?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And I never learned Telugu, and so it makes it very, very difficult to get around. And in addition to that, it's, there's not really, I mean, at least from my travels there, I mean, it's kind of disorganized and the cities can be pretty unclean. And it's just a lot. It's a lot to handle mentally, and I don't think the tourist infrastructure is where it needs to be quite yet to really get tourists into the country in the numbers that the government wants.
And what about your mother's region? What state is she from?
My mom is originates from Punjab.
Okay. But she's not Sikh. She's a Hindu Punjabi.
Hindu Punjabi. Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, her father, my grandfather, had to flee from what is today Pakistan into Indian Punjab at the time of partition. So to Maya's point about this sort of Hindu-Muslim beef, this is something that has been carried through my family for several generations now. but my mom's from Punjab, but she grew up in Bombay, which is in Maharashtra. Mumbai, yeah.
There seems to
Any question?
Oh, a couple things. One, humorous interlude, years ago. In fact, I had my 14th birthday in Hyderabad, which is
Oh, wow.
way back when. So I've been there. But, somebody once asked an Indian gentleman, what are the two best things, the two most important things that the British brought to India and left in India? Number one, the English language. Number two, cricket.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
You can't deny that.
Yeah. People get really into cricket in South Asia.
yeah.
Yeah.
I remember one time I was watching the Michigan Ohio State football game with my grandfather,
Wow.
the one who had to flee from Pakistan. And he didn't really know what was going on, but we were sitting together and watching it. And he was like, why are people so into this game? What's the significance? It's like, okay, think about it like the India-Pakistan cricket match. He's like, yeah, I understand completely.
But they also play New Zealand, Australia,
They do,
UK.
they do.
Yeah, but I think the
What is
rivalry
that?
between Pakistan and India,
India,
is very heated.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, if the Indians played Australia, it's just a
That
game.
gets
Yeah.
heated.
Yeah, but if they play Pakistan, it goes to the next.
Don't
iteration.
underestimate though the
Yeah.
rivalries with Australia.
Is Pakistani good?
It's really
that's
I think
that's a
off
pretty-
and on they are. Like, I don't follow cricket super closely, so not
Oh, okay.
What's up?
Is Pakistan good at cricket?
At the moment,
It
mediocre.
fluctuates. They
They're
were
mediocre.
better than India for a while, and now it's swapped.
I would say in the 2010s they were, or like early 2010s they were better. Recent years not nearly as much.
Which countries are the best in cricket?
Usually like Australia is usually like the best one. The English tend to be pretty good still.
India's gotten much.
Yeah, India.
The West Indies were like
Yeah, the
the
West
thing
Indies
back
are
in the day.
killing it.
Yeah.
Oh, how about Jamaicans? Because they play cricket
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think they play on the West Indies team.
South Africans are bad either. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
South
And Sri Lanka?
Is that right?
Yeah, Sri Lanka plays cricket.
So we are 30 minutes, so we officially enter the free form discussion debate period. Let me slip in the last question, because from your discussion about your family, also North versus South, I got the idea like North is probably more developed, more metro, and the South is more metropolitan, more developed than the North. Can you like more clarify, make it a clear picture for someone like me?
Yeah, it can vary by state, but I think on the whole, probably the South is more developed than the North. Like if I had to make, sort of one statement, the richest or most developed state in India is Kerala, which is like the furthest south, south and
Yeah,
to the
Kerala.
west.
The Christians hang out.
In what sense, most industry, or?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it just has, like, I don't have, like, specific, but, like, in terms of, like, Human Development Index or GDP per capita, it's
Wow.
highest there. I mean, maybe with the exception of Goa, but Goa is a tiny state on the west coast. It's like India's
Yeah.
Hawaii.
Yeah,
so.
the
The
Portuguese.
tourism industry is also more
Yeah,
developed there.
yeah, that's true,
Because Kerala was communist
Right,
at one point.
Yeah.
I don't know, are they still, or?
I think the communists are still involved in the government, but I don't know, like, too much about the specifics of it.
There are a few states where the communists still have a much
Yeah.
bigger presence.
West Bengal.
Yeah.
They're pretty big.
Yeah,
I know that's funny you mentioned that region because I saw a video from I think a Lithuanian YouTuber. He's basically roaming around that state with all the hammers and sickles, and he basically is telling his viewers, "Wow, this brings back many memories." If you can get what I mean.
Wow, that's
Yeah, there's
wild.
You know,
that I was like,
Yeah.
that doesn't make sense.
One of the things that I was listening to NPR years ago. I forgot what year it was,
Yeah, I mean,
but they
it's more
had a
violent,
segment
yeah.
where
That's the
where
financial
Tata
part.
Motors bought out Land
You know,
Rover,
the north is way more-
and it was like a national pride in India with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
so-
Because those were British
Yeah.
brands,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's a
the
British
north
brand,
has, like,
and
a
Tata
concentrated
Motors
areas
is an Indian brand.
of development,
Yep.
yeah.
exactly.
There's like a few
And,
cities in the north.
and I
like,
actually,
say, New Zealand, for
actually have a
example,
customer that brings a lot of product from India. They do hydraulic,
There's a couple
steel
cities
tubes,
in East and West,
you know,
like,
for
California,
hydraulic,
for example, that are very developed.
hydraulic systems.
Outside of,
Oh.
say,
So
the main
that-
urban
I
areas,
tell you what, they've been
it's
keeping me
not
busy.
super developed. And
Very,
lots of the
very,
suburbs
and most of that comes from, Tamil Nadu area.
but, like,
Hydraulic
usually
systems.
primarily
Yeah,
just
steel
electric.
tubes.
Wow,
So, like,
interesting. I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
maybe
And in fact, we have another customer
Oh,
that brings, castings, forgings from India. So their steel industry must be pretty good for that, because all the steel mill, on the mill test certificates that I look at, they're all manufactured in India. I haven't seen anything from China. You know, mostly it is homegrown steel that's been melted and smelted and melted in India, and then they form it into various articles there. So my question is, if does India, what do they use to melt the steel with? Because they don't have a lot of coal mines there, right? Or do they just import all their energy from the Gulf states?
I think, I mean, especially like the last few years, I've actually been importing a lot of oil from Russia.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Because to
They
be
get it
honest
in
with you, the
discount.
government was very smart when Russia got the sanctions on it when they invaded Ukraine. India bought the Russian oil for a fraction of the price,
And they
And
have
they've
their
been used-
refineries.
and then they used it for
refining
their
too.
oil reserves.
Yep, yep.
So I mean,
Just
that
get
was
it
a
on the
brilliant
sanction.
move, huh?
To get
I mean,
around
they've been
sanction.
friendly for a long
Turkey
time.
did too,
Yeah.
but sanction, but India got it on a bigger scale.
Well, India didn't have sanctions on Russia,
Right.
and it still doesn't.
The
Yeah.
sanctions not on India, and India refused to get on the sanction bandwagon on Russia. That gives them a free hand. They got a lot of pressure from the U.S., but they ignored them.
Well, India has always been the leader of the non-aligned world. You know, even during the Cold War, it didn't align with the West or the Soviet Union bloc. It basically wanted to be a free player, basically.
Basically, they're more on the in principle,
yeah.
yes. But in Cold War, India was more on the Soviet side,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
Pakistan
Yeah, they-
was more on the U.S. side.
That might be true, but they were still consider themselves non-aligned.
Yeah, of course. They want to reserve the rights
Yeah.
to
They
switch
want to
sides.
have
of-
flexibility in the
Yeah,
international system.
exactly.
Now,
That's pretty.
I was wondering, do you think India or Yugoslavia was the leader of the non-aligned movement?
I think India will probably be better, because India had more in common with the former British colonies of Africa, you know, and because that's where the third world, the non-aligned movement was located in the former colonies, and
Right.
India was the natural leader of all that.
They have the big conference.
I mean,
in
they're
the
still part of the
60s.
Commonwealth, you know. I mean, and actually, a few decades ago, the Commonwealth was a lot more important than it is now. But you know, India's always been like a leader in former British.
They still do the games, I think.
Huh?
They still do the games, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe the games, but I think they left
Yeah.
politically.
Do you
But-
have more information about land reform? I know it wasn't very successful, it didn't go very far. Do you have some historical information? And what do you see, how where is it standing right now?
Yeah, so one of the papers that I read covered it briefly. It didn't go into too much depth, but that's one that I'd love to get some more information on as well. But basically, what I read was they tried land reform in the late 70s, but basically there were some legal issues with essentially taking the land that was formerly titled to landlords and having the government take it, didn't have that right to do that just like that. And so while they had a lot of land that they wanted to redistribute, I think it was only 5% of the land that they thought that they were going to redistribute that actually ended up getting redistributed. So it didn't really work that well. Basically, yeah, it was a legal problem of the eminent domain or the right of people to own their own land essentially.
So it didn't progress much till this day.
I think Prime Minister Modi tried to do some sort of land reform effort a few years ago, but that engendered huge protests in Punjab, and so I think he backed down from it. I'd have to look into it more to comment, I think, more effectively, but I think high level, that's my understanding.
It's not an easy task, even for a communist country, even for China. In the beginning, they didn't go very smoothly, although that was their draw for when they were fighting the Civil War. That was the draw. We're gonna give you land, the peasants.
Yeah.
But after they got the power, they didn't really go. It didn't really go smoothly. It still took some time. It didn't come automatically just because you're communist.
It was like 1980, right? That they finally did land reform officially. Like they got rid of the
Centrally planned economy.
the collective farms.
Right.
Like-
About that time.
the-
Yeah,
the-
they
the-
took several. Yeah, collective farms. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of turmoil.
Well, another thing too that I would like to discuss, you know, outside of Indonesia, India has the world's second largest Muslim population, about 18 to 20% of the population of India. And I think Hindus are roughly about 79 or 80, or even less than that, or something, because
Sounds
about
right.
1% are Christians.
Yeah.
In fact, here's a little known fact: Nagaland is 80% Baptist Christian,
Yeah.
which is the sect of Christianity that I grew up in. So, and that's always fascinated me because it's a very diverse country. But my Indian neighbor who's from Andhra Pradesh, who speaks Urdu, who's Muslim, he was telling me that he was really upset with the government of India because Muslims have halal. They have a lot of beef where they slaughter, you know, and stuff like that. And the cow being a sacred animal to Hindus has caused a lot of friction between the two groups. In fact, he was very upset about it, and this was some years ago. And I didn't realize how much of a religious friction there was, but I guess it is. In fact, Modi is actually a Hindu nationalist, and that has actually been kind of friction with the Muslim community there. Do you know much about that you want to comment on, or?
I mean, so yeah, I do think that Modi's election has probably inflamed some tensions between Hindus and Muslims. I mean, in the past there have been communal riots, right? It's just kind of a regular feature of Indian history. And I think that electing someone to the office of Prime Minister, you know, electing a majority in Parliament that explicitly has a Hindu nationalist agenda is likely to inflame that. I think, in fact, Modi's party, the BJP, they one of their first things that really got them started was the early 90s. So there was this controversy around what's called like the Ayodhya Mosque. So Ayodhya in like Hindu literature is the place where like the god Ram was from, and you know it's mythologized, of course, but you know Hindus believe that this town in Uttar Pradesh, Ayodhya, is that place, and they think you know when Muslims came in the 1600s, they took down the temple, the Hindu
Oh,
temple
the
was
Mongols,
there.
the Mongols.
Yeah, the Mongols, right? And they built a mosque, and so there was a lot of tension. You know, there was always this strong desire, I think, among Hindus to take down the mosque there and rebuild a temple. And so in the early 90s, this really came to a fore, where you know the BJP and groups that were backing them essentially decided that you know they needed to take down the mosque so that a temple could be rebuilt. And then I think, if I remember correctly, they attacked it. And in fact, the origins of the BJP can actually trace back to the RSS, which is during partition, right? There was all this violence that I mentioned. The RSS was essentially the group that was organizing violence on the Indian side. On the Pakistani side, or on the Muslim side, there was the Muslim League, But yeah, the RSS was this sort of militant Hindu nationalist group that is essentially those same people who became the BJP, and they got their big political start, you know, with this religious controversy. It's kind of gone from there. So yeah, it's not great. But you know, I think there's a lot of support for what they're doing. One, because you know, Hindu nationalism at least is a way to unite Hindus, right? Because there's all these divisions, right? Within Indian society, it's language, it's caste, like, you know, there's all these different things. But with Hindu nationalism, you can bring lower caste Hindus to vote for you instead of, you know, voting for your opponent. A lot of the Congress Party, which was the, you know, party of Nehru and Indira Gandhi, they got support from like the lower classes more often. But you know, under the BJP, they're more effectively able to collect the votes of lower caste Hindus, and so it's worked electorally as a strategy for them.
So the caste system is it strictly within Hinduism? Does it go out to other religious groups or ethnic groups?
I think it's within Hinduism, and I mean, like like Islam and Sikhism don't really have the caste system.
And Christians don't have a caste
yeah.
system either.
Yeah.
Not in that way.
But you know, even though they don't have like a formal caste system, the societies are still very hierarchical, still very like it's still kind of set up in the same way as like Hindu castes are, quote unquote, just in the sense of like the level of hierarchy, the level of like, you know, tracing back your lineage, and that's kind of determining what you do. But no, the caste system, I think, is limited to formally Hinduism.
So what's the percentage of population are Hindus?
I think Robert had it about right.
About
right?
79 to 80%.
79, 80?
About
Yeah,
80%.
Muslims are about 19 to 20, and Christians are about one.
I think it's around. I think it's like 80, 15, 5. Because like there are some other smaller religions too, right? Sikhism, Buddhism.
Oh yeah, that's right too. Yeah.
What?
Judaism also.
There are not that many Jews.
Very small.
It's there's more Parsis, I think, the Zoroastrians.
They
Yeah,
all
yeah.
have.
There's
And also
about a
there's
million.
Sing.
There's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
million.
yeah.
There's a million Parsis there.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
million or two.
I have a question. So this caste system, is it existing all over India? Like, for example, what's the first class name?
The Brahmins.
Brahmin.
Yeah.
So is it like in every area there's Brahmin like that?
Yeah.
Because I think I read some history about India. Like this caste system built is because of the invasion of another ethnicity from the west.
Yeah.
They are essentially they were a different ethnicity, and then they invaded India,
Yeah.
and then they sort of ruled the local people. So that's why the caste system is also more like sort of like a different ethnicity. Like the top is like the invader, they're the ruling class, and then the people at the bottom is like bottom caste.
Yeah, I think.
Right, the locals are more likely they're the lowest caste, right?
Yeah, I mean, this invasion I think was like 4,000 years ago.
More like 5.
Yeah. So you know, it's of course been a little while, but I think like that's probably like the origins of the caste system. You know, this goes back pretty ancient, and I don't actually have all of the knowledge to fully comment like going that far back, but I think that's about right. I think that's where the genesis of it is from.
So like how much percentage people is like for each caste from, and is it like, is there more, for example, first class in capital like cities, or is it like they exist in rural area to all kinds of cities?
I mean, there's
Is it like a pyramid?
Yeah, I mean,
so
it
it's
is.
it's kind of like a pyramid, but I mean, like each person in each caste had, you know, individual responsibilities. Like Brahmins, although at the top, are primarily like people who are, you know, at temples and stuff like that. You know, they're not
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who's
business.
Brahmin.
Yeah, they're not typically like business owners as much as they are often like either academics and scholars
Or gurus.
yeah, or like doing religious duties. So they do tend to be spread out throughout the country, but there's not a huge amount of them. Because I mean, like for example, how many like priests do you need in a parish? You don't need 1,000 of them. Right? It's kind of similar, but like for example, the merchant caste. There's quite a few of them. I have like read like that theory that the caste system wasn't extremely reinforced prior to the arrival of the British, but honestly I'm not familiar enough with it to comment on it. But at least I can say among some of like my family friends and you know their friends who live in India, although it's still prevalent and present, the influence is slowly decreasing.
So I mean,
Especially in cities.
yeah, that's true. To the point on like the British involvement in the caste system, the caste system existed prior to the British, right? This goes back 5,000 years. But when the British were ruling India, one of the things that they did is they kind of made the positions of the subcastes harder to change. So what do I mean by that? So you know, I said that there are like 5 major castes in India, right? But within that, there are a bunch of subcastes. So it's not just, you know, you're in the one caste and that's it. It's like there's a high level caste, and there's a subcaste, and there might be a subcaste of a subcaste, or like something like that, right? It can get pretty complicated. But basically what, before the British, right, different rulers of different polities in India might choose to push one subcaste over another within the caste system, you know, just to sort of reward supporters or, you know, things like that. But when the British came, they didn't have an understanding of these dynamics, and so when they were ruling over India, they kind of froze them in place. And so essentially ever since the British were, you know, have been in India, you know, the caste system was kind of reinforced by the British. And then one of the other things that they did, which is not like super related to caste, but still kind of ties in, is they had this theory called like the martial races theory, which basically said that, you know, there's certain groups of people that are suitable for fighting wars, you know, for being soldiers, right? And there's certain groups of people who are, you know, bandits or thugs, or, you know, whatever, right? Like that sort of thing. And so there are, you know, they made certain groups of people, or, you know, they brought certain groups of people at very high rates into the army, that sort of thing. And so, you know, that's like kind of like another sort of like reinforcement of caste, or, you know, adjustment of caste a little bit under the British system. But that's more, it can also be more closely tied into like language or ethnicity, that sort of thing.
What about the wealth distribution among these castes? Like, for example, among all the richest people, and for example, professionals, are there are there more first, second class among the rich people now?
Yeah, I mean, the farmer caste, I think, generally tends to not be very wealthy. And the lower caste, the untouchables, tend to be very poor.
So are there untouchable class now are rich or
No, they're not.
doing
No.
being a doctor, a professional job?
I
It would
think
be
they're
very
a
hard.
little bit. I think they're doing, better than they used to be, but they're still.
So the lowest caste, more so than the other castes, did not reap benefits from the development of India in the same way, because like they were the poorest of the poor, and they were largely living in slums, and they had the lowest prestige jobs, such as dealing with corpses, cleaning streets, that type of thing.
Education, did they get much?
No education.
No education.
So there's no such a
There was no.
class for them.
So it was almost the opposite. So you mentioned the emergency. One of the most infamous things that happened during the emergency was the forced sterilization program, where there was always this concern about overpopulation in India and regulating population. And to be clear, this was pushed and supported and in many ways incentivized by Western countries. India would forcibly sterilize men and women, and this vastly disproportionately targeted extremely poor people, i.e. the Dalit population, the untouchable population. And so not only were they not receiving economic benefits, they were not receiving educational benefits, but they were also being forcibly sterilized. And
what's the difference?
they were
They can't reproduce.
they can't
They're
reproduce.
not allowed to.
They would they would take
Oh, they
away.
take it away.
They
Oh,
would
Yeah.
yeah.
Either vasectomies or hysterectomies.
Yeah, no, actually, Lyndon B. Johnson threatened to withhold food imports to India if they didn't do more sterilizations. Like, this was very actively pushed by the
That
West.
sounds like something he would do.
Yeah, his foreign policy decisions were really.
I'm not a big fan of LBJ.
Lyndon Johnson was president in the 60s, if you're talking about the
Oh,
emergency.
but then
that
in
was
the
70s.
emergencies, that's when they buckled down on it. This is a lasting policy. It's always been there. It still happens. But during the emergency, Indira Gandhi's son spearheaded the program. His name was Sanjay Gandhi, and at the peak of it, they were sterilizing over 5,000 people a day. Like,
Oh, wow.
they
Just grab people
sterilized
off the
millions
street?
of people. Yeah, no, they would pick people off the street. Police would just take them to these clinics. They would get sterilized, and then they would just be let go.
And wasn't there
Just
a
like that.
protest
Just like
on
that.
that or outcry or?
There, I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
but
they
who
were-
were they targeting?
They were
The people with no
yeah.
power.
So this also happening in big cities.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
this happened everywhere.
Countrywide.
So how do you reconcile
and
that?
70s?
Sorry?
That
How do
was
you
the
reconcile?
heat of it was in the 70s, late 70s.
How do you reconcile that reality with the democratic system?
That's the problem of it, right?
It's a great question.
How? It's a
I mean,
question that has not
If you
been
look at
answered.
Australia and also Canada and the United States, there was also forced sterilization of the Aboriginal group.
Yes, it's
So,
a, it's
I mean,
a known
it's
technique. Yeah.
it's been going on for a long time. People who are not considered to be part of the mainstream population, they want to eradicate them. The Aborigines of Australia were sterilized, and their children were sent to English boarding
It
schools
was the
or
same in
something like
the
that.
First
Native
Nations in
Americans
Canada.
like the Navajo and the Cherokee were done the same way, and then even in Canada, the Aboriginal peoples up there were done the same way. And to be honest with you, forced sterilization is actually even common in China. So it is a government policy that a lot of governments have been doing around the world.
Even if it's a little under the
Right,
radar.
so, I mean, this is a maybe a very basic question. So in the case of US or Canada or Australia for that matter, what stopped them from going out to get a lawyer to sue whoever
Well,
that's
most
doing
of
that?
most of these happen in America. At least it happened, there was a period of time between 1880 and the 1900s where eugenics was the basic thing. Charles Darwin's the survival of the species. A lot of people got onto that idea and they took eugenics to the next level.
Yeah, that's ideology,
Yeah,
but when
yeah.
they implement it, what stops a group
Well, you
or
didn't have
individual from
people
going
didn't
out
care
to
about you.
They
People
can't
didn't care.
to assert their rights?
Yeah.
They can't
How
afford.
did
That's,
they afford
that's
it?
one thing.
Poor
Right? That's
people
one
don't
reason.
Can't afford
Poor
it.
people can't afford lawyers.
But also, like, if you
That's
look at India, so first of all, like the U.S. has a very legal system centric society. So you get wrong, sue them. Go to court, get your justice. That's that's the attitude here. That's not true.
living, right?
Right, exactly. That's how I'm gonna make my money. But it's not true of every culture, and so India is different. Even today, it would have been much more so in the 70s.
Well, you had a very active Supreme Court there that kind
So
of.
India has an extremely active Supreme Court, even more so than the U.S. one. They're very,
Right, exactly.
very hands-on. However, the general Indian legal system is absolutely swamped like flooded,
Okay.
years and years and years behind on every single case.
Yeah.
And so if you are angry that the government is doing questionable things to your family and you sue, assuming you somehow scrap the money together to sue, which is probably not going to happen, your case is not going to be heard.
Right.
And so
10 years.
what are you like, you can't just keep scrapping by for 10 years hoping that case is going to go in your favor by some miracle. Like, it's not going to happen. So they just don't do it.
I see.
So people know that the legal system is just not really going to work. So they've solved their problems through other means.
Yeah, because I was just saying, if you don't have a legal recourse, then the only other recourse you have is violence.
Yes, and so exactly, and that is a big cultural thing in India where it's like you go get your justice yourself, and that results in a lot of unjustified violence as well. Like going back to the cows thing, it's a very like ugly reality. The whole cows laws stuff,
Right.
very clearly targeting the Muslim population, and there are these cow riots where these groups of rioters will accuse a Muslim family of harboring beef, essentially. They will kill them, and then they'll go in the house, find no beef, and be like, well, okay, we were wrong. Next house, and then we'll move on to the next
But then the
people.
Muslim community gets really upset and
Yeah,
do
but they
counter.
have minimal power. And so I actually am hoping to write a paper on this for a law journal, but basically what these laws do is that they push these sentiments and kind of push people to take the law into their own hands, seek out their own justice in this situation, and then look the other way at the negative benefits, because those negative benefits are the actual purpose of the law, right? Like if you have a Hindu nationalist government who is pushing anti-Muslim policy, it's not a mistake that these beef
understand
laws
that.
are resulting in dead Muslims.
But they
right?
run the risk of the Muslim community becoming a fifth column if they were ever to go to war with Pakistan.
I mean, gone to war with Pakistan multiple
They've done
times.
it a few
Yeah, I know,
times,
but-
What's the situation now with Bangladesh? There's no issues, I don't think, or few issues.
They're
I think, right?
making territorial claims,
Yeah.
but
Is it-
realistically, it's probably not much that's
Because
gonna
they're
happen.
too poor.
I mean, Bangladesh is actually richer per capita than Pakistan. I showed that graph at the very beginning. It's actually surprisingly quite a bit richer per person than Pakistan
Also,
is.
when Bangladesh sought independence, India actually
Yeah.
helped
Yeah,
them
yeah,
because
yeah.
India and
Divide.
Pakistan had their whole thing, so
Yeah.
they were like, "Yeah, sure, I'll help you leave
Was it like a
Pakistan."
divide and conquer thing too?
Yeah, but also the Pakistanis absolutely tried to genocide the Bengalis,
Yes.
and then also launched a preemptive strike on India to try and make sure that they wouldn't help the Bengalis, and then that gave India the excuse.
That was under Indira Gandhi. She
Yeah.
won that war so strongly that it made her extremely popular. She was flying high till emergency.
Are the main things now issues Jammu and Kashmir with Pakistan?
That's been an issue since.
But it's kind of on and off. It's not that bad now, I guess. Or is it kind of like a demilitarized zone or something?
It's like an autonomous
It's
colony that's not
militarized.
really autonomous.
They actually the Indian government, or there's a detachment of the Indian military that's on the Siachen Glacier, and that's actually the highest altitude of permanent detachment of the military anywhere in the world.
Oh, the Indus River headwaters.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because the Indus River flows through Pakistan, and most of their irrigation is from the
Yeah.
Indus River.
Is it mostly border disputes like that, or are there other issues too?
Between India and Pakistan.
Yeah, what are the most?
I mean, they've got nukes pointed at each other.
Well,
Yeah.
that too.
Which puts them in a weird stalemate at the same time.
Yeah.
So
The two countries hate each other for pretty much eternity.
It's,
No,
it's
and
as
the
bad as
novel-
it's been.
In the World War Z novel, and there was one chapter where it's a sci-fi novel, basically, zombie war and all that. But they were basically saying that Iran and Pakistan in the novel used nukes at each other because they had no chain of communication like Pakistan and India had. Because when you got your nuclear weapons pointed at each other, people don't want to make the wrong move, so there's constant communication. Just like in the Cold War between the Soviets and Americans. There was a red button, but there was some communication there to make sure nobody didn't accidentally touch that red button.
I was wondering, when you say that conflict between Pakistan and India is the same vein as like, Republic of Peru